dear sister Sasha. I became properly seduced by the year when I was walking through the streets of Mexico City in 2001. I was staying with some friends called O'Hara, actually, and they'd all gone out, and I was left to my own devices at home, and they had a parrot. And I spent a while trying to teach the parrot how to say feck. And eventually it didn't really pan out, and I got a bit bored, so I decided to go for a walk. And I found myself walking down and standing in front of a memorial to the San Patricios, which was this battalion of mostly Irish soldiers who had fought in the Mexican army against the US army in a war that raged through 1847. And they had been executed on this very spot where I was now standing. And so that was pretty fascinating to suddenly see 1847 in a more global context. And that whole Mexican-American war was a pretty fascinating event. Basically, the US invaded Mexico. Watch out, President Trump. And they invaded and they occupied Mexico City, and there were 7 or 8 battles, and Mexico lost every one of them. And at the end of the battle, at the end of the war, Mexico was obliged to surrender all control over Texas as well as California, New Mexico, large chunks of Utah, Wyoming. That all went from Mexico to the US. So massive shift there. But you know, it is Black 47 for us. It is the worst year of the famine, 1847. And the statistics, 170 years later, are really hard for us to try and get our heads around. It looks like nearly 400,000 people may have died in 1847 alone in Ireland of starvation and disease, primarily cholera. And then you have another 250,000 that emigrated to the UK or across to Canada and down into the USA from there. So in Toronto, for instance, the population at the start of the year, 20,000. It trebles to 60,000 over the course of the year. You know, massive impact that that the event happened. And it's good that we're here because, I don't know if you know, the Epic Ireland Centre, which is downstairs, but it's really good, and it tells the history of the Irish abroad and what they did all over the world. And it's not just the harrowing stories, but it's a lot of more upbeat stories as well. And we were down there earlier with my daughters, and I totally encourage you to call back and go down there. But what happened in Ireland during that time was shocking and heartbreaking and almost entirely indefensible, really. But we should bear in mind that what happened there is kind of being replicated in many places over the world today. And I think, you know, we should of course lament the hundreds of thousands who died during the famine, absolutely. But I think when you think of the coffin ships that swirled in the waters of Canada, we should also be thinking of the 10,000 plus men, women and children who have drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean in the last 2.5 years.
Hear, hear.
And you know, instead, instead of getting angry and shouting at the past, because the famine stirs people up, of course, we would be better to channel our energies into trying to end the famines that presently rage in places like Yemen and Nigeria and the Horn of Africa, where over 30 million people are presently on the cusp of starvation. Okay, that's my political bit over, but this book is not about the famine. But because it's set in 1847, inevitably that event casts a huge and long shadow all over the world. I've opted to focus on the sort of generosity that it inspired amongst an extraordinary group of people, such as Tom Thumb, General Tom Thumb, who was this 2-foot-tall performer from Connecticut, who was the world's #1 performer in 1847. He played to 5 million people in Europe before he went home to the USA, and on his voyage home he donated a chunk of money to Irish famine relief. So too did the Choctaw Indians, who had been driven west by the white man across the Mississippi, and then they found it in their hearts and souls in order to contribute to Irish famine relief. Or the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who was one of the richest men in the world, who also donated a large amount of money and is well celebrated in Drogheda of all places. So Rodney Baxter, who is a wonderful grizzled old sea dog from Cape Cod, he packed a schooner full of provisions of corn and flour and so forth, gets into his schooner and sails it across all the way into County Sligo, into Sligo Port in 1847. And on his way back, he actually breaks the record for the fastest ever time going that away across the Atlantic in a schooner. Another similar guy, Black Ben Forbes, who was a merchant from Boston, who made his fortune selling opium to the Chinese in the 1830s. He persuades the US government to loan him a warship, which he likewise gets filled with provisions from all over Massachusetts. And he then sails this ship into Cove and unloads it, where it is very gratefully received, before he goes on a whirlwind tour of famine-ravaged Cork with no less a man than Father Theobald Matthew, who is the Apostle of Temperance, so a very unlikely alliance of the Apostle of Temperance and the opium magnate. So, look, I mean, the point of this book is it is to be global. I wanted to stop the clock in 1847 and see what was going on all around the world. I was formerly a travel writer, I still do a little bit, but I lived in Hong Kong for a few years, so I was really interested to see what was going on in other places. And in Vietnam, for instance, where the French bombed Da Nang in 1847, which is arguably the opening shots of the conquest of French Indochine, or China with the Opium War, or South Australia, or Argentina, all these places. The USA, my daughters are thrilled to know that the doughnut was invented in 1847. But you know, lots going on in America. The Mormons made their way to Salt Lake City, Utah. San Francisco was born, and everybody was singing "Oh Susanna" with a banjo on my knee. And I wanted to talk about entertainers and to an extent the celebrities from that age. So I have talked about people like General Tom Thumb and Lola Montez and Pablo Franque, this brilliant black equestrian performer who ended up, he was immortalized, if you're a Beatles fan, in the song "Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite," who was an icon of 1847. Okay, I'm very nearly there. Europe was on the eve of the 1848 revolutions. If this one goes well, I might do 1848 next. I view Europe through people like the nonsense poet Edward Lear, who was travelling around Sicily and so forth. And I also want to give a quick shout out to poor Ignaz Semmelweis, who nobody's ever heard of. And Ignaz was a Hungarian obstetrician who worked out the reason why so many European mothers were dying, I'm afraid, in maternity hospitals in the 1840s. And he worked it out in 1847 that it was simply because the doctors weren't washing their hands properly. Anyway, the curse for him was that nobody believed him, and he ended up dying in a lunatic asylum. So I'm hoping that my chapter will vindicate and resurrect poor old Ignaz. I have said before that 1847 is 170 years ago. Which may seem like a long time ago, but it is also only 2 85-year-olds ago. And over the course of the Vanishing Ireland project with my friend Mr. James Fennell here, I was astonished by the number of times we met people who their grandparents were either children or teenagers at the time of the famine in the 1840s. So we're really very close to it. In fact, I met a man giving a talk recently whose grandfather was born in 1847, and he was in his 50s. I mean, it's extraordinary. So much has changed in that time. For women, for starters, there may have been a woman on the throne, but otherwise you guys were second-class citizens, which is one reason why the Bronte sisters all published their books pretending to be men. And dear children, 1847, you guys would have been stuffed up chimneys all day long. But the good news was the 1847 Factory Act meant that you could only stay up there for 10 hours a day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming. It's huge. And Luca, thank you again for that wonderful.